Hello, everybody. My name is Denis Godlevsky, and I'm the regional coordinator of ITPC in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And we are having our third conversation dedicated to the 1st of December. And I have my lovely co-host, Daria. Daria, over to you.
Hello, my name is Daria Mikulch. I'm PR manager in International Treatment Preparedness Coalition in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I'm working on the article about Энтони Фаучи. We are preparing to the materials for the World AIDS Day, and we would like to talk you, David, about Энтони Фаучи, about emergence of the ACT UP movement, and about everything what happened in those terrible years.
Because of the COVID and because of the fact that you, David, have not traveled to our region for a while, and there are a lot of new activists, I probably have to introduce you. So it's our big pleasure to have as a guest Mr. Дэвид Барр, who is one of the early days ACT UP activists, who is the founding father of ITPC Global, one of the founding fathers, Collaborative Fund, an expert on HIV and AIDS, who has been working for UNAIDS, HIV Young Leaders Fund, and many, many, many other great and lesser great initiatives. It's lovely to have you, David. We've been missing you a lot.
Hi, Dennis. Hi, Daria. Very, very nice to talk to you both. It's been way too long since I've been there to visit. I miss it very, very badly. I wish the world was in a better place.
Yeah, we too. We're gonna speak about that in a while, but first, Daria, go ahead. Maybe you can start with the first question, and then we'll move on from there.
Okay, I'm ready to start. I have the first question. David, what becomes the reference point for emergence the ACT UP movement?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What was the starting point for the appearance, the emergence of the ACT UP movement?
Well, the starting point was AIDS.
Thank you very much. Next question.
More details, please.
Okay, so AIDS was first, the symptoms of illness that were eventually called AIDS were first seen in 1981. We saw, and the first cases that were really discovered were diagnosed were in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco. There were many other places in the world, particularly in Africa, where people were getting sick and dying of something new. We didn't know what it was yet. But it was in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles where the first cases were officially identified. And they were identified by sort of a series of symptoms that quickly led to death and amongst gay men in the United States. And the number of people who were getting sick and dying was increasing fairly rapidly. Eventually, that set of symptoms began to be called AIDS. And in 1984, I guess, the virus that causes AIDS, the HIV virus, was discovered. And that's how we developed a better understanding of what AIDS is and how people get it. The government in the US was very uninterested in addressing this new, emerging, very, very deadly disease. mostly because of who was getting sick and who was dying, and that was gay men and drug users. And so the failure of the government to act led to the development of a political movement. It led to many things. It led to service delivery. The response from the community was about developing services and in education and information, but it also led to a political movement to get the government and industry to act and begin to respond to this new disease. And you have to remember, back then, there was no treatment at all. There was very, very little prevention information. And so people were getting sick and dying very quickly. This is before we even had an HIV test. We got the HIV test in 1985, and that meant people could at least find out whether they were infected or not, but there was nothing you could really do to keep people well at that time. We formed a political response through ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, to get the government to act. And our main interest was the research that needed to be done to develop treatments.
What were you doing before ACT UP? Where were you at these times?
Just before ACT UP started, I was in law school in New York City. I'm a native New Yorker. I was born in New York. New York has the largest community of gay men in the US and maybe in the world. And so New York was really the epicenter of the epidemic at the time. AIDS was unavoidable if you were a gay man in New York in the early 1980s. And I was going to law school and while I was in law school, I started to do some work around sort of gay rights work. And that immediately led me into AIDS work.
Okay. Do you think that it is fair, because when you read the kind of the official history, right, or at least Wikipedia about AIDS, do you think it is fair to say that the Denver conference that was before, like several years, and the Denver conference of LGBT people, there was no Q back then yet, that it sort of was a starting point for ACT UP later on, or not really? What do you think about that?
So there was I don't remember the exact year, maybe it was 1983, but it was early that there was a conference, an LGBT health conference that was held in Denver. And there were a number of people living with AIDS at the conference, and they took over the conference at one point. They marched onto the stage and they read a manifesto that was called the Denver Principles. And those principles laid out, I think, what would really become the foundation for the AIDS movement and much of the AIDS response moving forward all over the world. So it wasn't just a starting point for ACT UP. It was really a starting point for the AIDS movement. And at the heart of the Denver Principles was a call that that people living with AIDS were not victims. We were people who wanted to be in control of the decisions made that affected our lives, that we should be at the heart of all policy and program development that affected people living with AIDS, and that we demanded respect and we demanded dignity. And so the notion of sort of people living with AIDS, I think before the Denver Principles, the term was always like AIDS victim. And instead it got turned into people living with AIDS, that we weren't all going to automatically die. We were living with the disease, and that we should be really in the forefront of decision making. And that still is very much, I think, the heart of the AIDS response today, or it should be.
I have a question that, in my opinion, very much correlates with the current reality. It was tough times. People were dying. You had to go to the funerals, obviously, often, and you had the administration and the government, which we currently have in many countries across the world, that are not really willing to invest into something that involves people who, as there was this quote from somebody, like, they don't want to get their heads out of their crouches or something like this. So these kind of people.
Yeah.
Where did you gain hope? What were your feelings? Like, was it the feeling of, okay, let's do something before we are gone, before we are over? Or was there hope? Was there a laughter? If you don't mind me asking about this more of a personal note.
Sure. The feeling of hope came from our coming together as a community. You know, even if the government was ignoring us, even if the society was homophobic, the way that we came together as a community was incredibly powerful. And whether that was for political action or helping people who were sick or teaching people how to stay uninfected, you know, feeding people, taking them to the doctor, all of that work where the communities came together was just incredibly powerful. And despite the fear and the grief, our times together as a group really gave us strength and gave us a great deal of joy. So that's really, I think, how we banded together, was how we protected ourselves and protected one another.
Were there times when there should have been the times when people felt burnt out doing the same job, and like there is still no treatment and we still like do the same thing, or not really? So how were you able to like re-inspire yourself in the time of the devastation?
In those times, there was no time to stop, right? Everything was moving very, very fast. Every day, somebody else would get sick, somebody else would die, some new political problem emerged, some crisis in the city or in the country. So there was no time to stop. We always said it was like living in a war. And so there wasn't really that much time to sort of say, oh, I'm tired. You just kept moving. And one of the hardest things really was that there was no time to grieve. You know, you'd lose someone and you go to a funeral or a memorial service and it was sad, and then it was over and you'd get back to work. There was really no time to just stop. It wasn't until much later when actually we had some treatment and we could begin to breathe a little easier that it actually got harder to grapple with what had happened and what was still happening, how to grapple with the grief and the anger and the loss. Because all of a sudden there was a little bit of breathing room. And, but in those early days, there was never any time to stop.
Last question before we move on to the main topic, also like more maybe on your personal memories. What was the funniest? Because I know you told me once you had a lot of laughter these days, because that was also the mechanism to cope with what was going on. What was the funniest moment that comes up to your mind when you think of these times?
The funniest, that's hard. I don't know, can you think of something that I said? Because I can't think of but the funniest thing, I guess, you know, ACT UP was a mix of all kinds of people. Young, old, black, white, Latino, gay, straight, men, women, but really queer and New Yorkers. So we were very funny. And we were funny in a very sarcastic kind of way. That's a New York humor.
Okay, we are from St. Petersburg. We're getting you.
So we were always really funny, sort of bitchy with each other, and that helped make us laugh. And we brought that humor and that sort of sensibility and kind of a camp queer sensibility to the demonstrations. The chanting we would do was not always funny, but sometimes it was very funny. We went to a demonstration once at a shopping mall that was owned by Donald Trump, but I can't really remember why we were there.
It's a pity you didn't meet the guy back at the time. Sorry.
I know, but and the chant was, we're here, we're queer, we're not going shopping, you know, and the policemen always used to wear rubber gloves when they would come to the demonstrations. And so our chant was, your gloves don't match your shoes. Your gloves don't match your shoes. Because, you know, if you're a society lady, you wear matching gloves and shoes if you go to an event. So I don't know, just not great examples, but we try to keep things funny.
Okay. Daria, do you have any more questions?
Yes, let's go back a little for those years. David, do you think who are the decision makers heard ACT UP's voice in those years?
Have the decision makers heard the ACT UP voice back in the years?
Did they hear it, or why did they hear it?
Why did they hear it?
They heard it because we were really loud. And, you know, it's a good question. We weren't that large of a group. It wasn't like we were, you know, 100,000 people in the streets. We were a couple of hundred or 1,000 or 2,000 people. It wasn't that big of a group. But again, we were mostly comprised of gay men in New York. And gay men in New York work for the advertising industry. They work for the arts industries, right? They sell Madonna and Coca-Cola. And that's, you know, historically, we've been involved in those kinds of industries, media. And many people within ACT UP took those skills. That wasn't my skill, but you know, people took those skills and applied it to our work in AIDS. So the artwork, the visuals, our use of the media, and the way that we engaged the press, the way that we staged the demonstrations so that even though there weren't a lot of people, they were very loud, they were very colorful, they were very visual. People would dress up, and so the visual nature of the demonstrations were sort of staged as theater, and that the press loved it, right? It became television that was interesting for people. So we got a lot of attention that way. Well, and very often, the image we were presenting was, even though we were like radical and loud and queer, sexy, we also presented a very sympathetic image to the public, right? We were people dying of a disease demanding that the government act. why can't we get our hands on experimental drugs, as an example? That was an important issue at the time. So, the average person could see this on television and say, well, yeah, these people are dying. Why can't they get what they need? So I think our work in the media was very important in getting the message across, not just to the sort of decision makers, but to the public at large. That was one important piece. But the other important piece, equally important, was we did our homework. None of us really came into the work with a background in science and medicine. Right? I was an actor, and then I became a lawyer. Greg Gonsalves, you've already talked to Greg. He studied Russian poetry. Peter was a stockbroker. None of us came into this with a background in science, but we knew that we had to learn the science, learn the clinical research process in order to have an intelligent conversation and in order to do an analysis of what was going wrong. So when we wrote our documents, when we got into the room with the decision makers, we knew our stuff. And they began to see, oh, these guys, they actually sort of know what they're talking about, and they have some good ideas. And it takes me back to the question you asked about the Denver principles. The Denver principles stated that people with AIDS had to be involved in decision-making around policy and program. When we actually started meeting with decision makers, we began to show them that having us in the room made for better science. We brought in a perspective that was going to make the clinical research process work better. And it took several years, but they began to value that. And they began to listen, and we began to develop relationships.
And this is the moment, more or less, when you started to get into the rooms with this academia people, scientists, where Энтони Фаучи comes into stage. When was the time you first met him? What is your first impression? What do you remember about him?
So Энтони Фаучи, I've known Энтони Fauci since, I guess, must have been 1988 or 89 was the first time I met him. I don't really remember the very first time we met, but he was, relatively young doctor scientist, and he was the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. This was 1989. He still is the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and he was in charge of the development of the AIDS research program in the US, which was the largest AIDS research program in the world. So all of our documents that were analyzing the research process and making recommendations for how it should be ramped up and changed went to many researchers, but they all had to go to Tony as well. I can tell two stories about sort of the very, very early days with Tony. One is a story about Tony doing something bad, and the other is a story about Tony doing something good. Is that okay?
Okay.
All right, so the first is the bad one. So we're talking now about probably 1987, 1988. Again, there was no treatment for AIDS. People were beginning to look at the drug AZT as a possible treatment. AZT was the first drug approved to treat HIV, but they were overdosing people, they were giving people very high doses. The side effects from it were terrible. People were dying from the side effects if they weren't dying from AIDS. And whatever positive effect the drug was having was also not lasting very long, right? Maybe you'd get better for a little while, but then it would stop working. So it was not a great drug, but it was the only drug. But the biggest killer of people with AIDS at the time was pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Right? So it's a rather rare form of pneumonia that really people would only get if their immune systems were severely weakened. And most people with AIDS died of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, PCP. And you could be fine, and then in a couple of days, all of a sudden, you'd be really sick with pneumonia, and you'd end up in the hospital, and a few days later, you'd be dead. It was that fast. That's really how AIDS was discovered. There were a group of, and we had some treatment for PCP that was not incredibly effective, but it was effective. And that treatment, there were two different kinds of drugs being used. One was a sulfa derivative drug, and the other was a drug called pentamidine. And there were a group of people living with AIDS and their doctors, including some doctors who were living with AIDS. And they began to look at if they took this drug, pentamidine, and they aerosolized it, right? So they made it like a mist and you breathed it into your lungs, would that prevent you getting PCP in the first place? So it was a rather radical approach. It hadn't been tried before, but they were trying it. Remember, there was nothing, right? So you were going to die. So let's try whatever we can. So they tried it and they began to say, you know what, this seems to be working. So they went to, so these doctors and some people with AIDS went to the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease and met with Tony Fauci and said to him, we've been trying this aerosolized form of pentamidine, and we think it may be effective in preventing PCP and preventing the leading cause of death from AIDS. And we think that you should start a study of it so we can really find out if it's working. And Tony said no. Tony said, well, we're really more interested in this AZT drug, and that's where we're going to focus our research. And he sent them away. So they left, and that group developed their own research protocol. It was the first example of community-based research in AIDS. And they did a randomized controlled study where they tested aerosolized pentamidine to prevent PCP, and the study overwhelmingly showed that it was effective. And that was really the first breakthrough in HIV treatment that we had that was significant, because we could now prevent the leading cause of death. And that really was a major, major change. So that was Tony making a pretty bad mistake.
Do you think it would be possible to speed up drug development? And if so, could Fauci contribute to this process?
It's not just possible to speed up drug development. We did speed up drug development, right? And so ultimately, when protease inhibitors were approved for use in 1996, which gave us a very, very effective treatment regimen of 3 drugs, those drugs, the protease inhibitors, were approved faster than any drugs in the history of drug development. The drug development time was cut in half, partly because we as advocates pushed so hard to streamline the process and look to come up with ways that where the research process could move faster, but without sacrificing quality.
But in this case with PCP that you described, and this trial, which is, I think, amazing that the doctors and the advocates were, motivated to, go till the end against probably one of the highest authorities back then in terms of the clinical trials. Did you ever discuss it afterwards? What was the reason why he said no? And how many subjects were there, if you remember, in that trial, approximately, like a number?
So I don't remember how many people were in the study. It was, it was a long time ago, and there've been a lot of studies since. But this is an issue I've discussed with Tony for years. His thinking at the time, first of all, it's still relatively early in AIDS. There isn't a lot of money for AIDS research. There isn't a lot of different things to actually study. And Tony's thinking at the time was, if we can get a drug that attacks the virus itself, right, that can attack or stop HIV from destroying a person's immune system, that would be the most important thing to do. And that was true, right? That's true. Ultimately, we needed an antiviral treatment regimen that would not just stop one disease, PCP, but stop all of the diseases that people with AIDS get because their immune system is weakened. So the most important thing would really be to stop the virus from weakening your immune system. And that was the strategy behind AZT. So it wasn't that that strategy was wrong. AZT by itself wasn't a very good drug. But so Tony felt like, I need to focus on that strategy. And this other idea of preventing one of the many opportunistic infections that people get was just not considered a priority to him. And it was a mistake, because he underestimated maybe how long it was going to take to develop an effective antiviral strategy, that it was going to be more complicated than they thought. And the need to prevent and treat opportunistic infections really is, what got many of us through the first 10 years.
Okay, go ahead with the second story.
Okay, so the second story, the good Tony story is, so we go to the International AIDS Conference in Montreal. This is 1989. Now, now the people who
I was 6.
You were 6, and it was already my second International AIDS Conference, and up until that point, the AIDS conference had been relatively small. The first one was 3 years before that. It was maybe 100 people in a room. And then Paris the year after was a little bit bigger. And then in Stockholm, it became in 1988, it was a larger conference, a couple of thousand people. But it was in Stockholm, right? In Sweden, a country with basically no HIV at the time. Very nice place, and it was white nights. I mean, it was very nice, but there was no AIDS, and so there was no AIDS community, and so there wasn't that much that happened in Stockholm. The AIDS movement was still very young, but the year after, 1989, ACT UP was at its height of strength, particularly in New York. And Montreal is a 6-hour drive from New York City. So we loaded up the buses and we descended on Montreal. And it was the first time ever that the AIDS conference really felt the AIDS movement and saw the AIDS movement. Sort of by accident, we took over the opening ceremony of the conference. It wasn't something we were planning on doing. It just kind of happened, and we were the first ones in the large auditorium, and we took the stage and took over the stage. And so all of the conference delegates, the doctors, the government people, the pharmaceutical industry people, the researchers, as they came into the room for the opening ceremony of the conference, they were confronted with AIDS activists for the first time ever. It was a really historic and powerful moment. And we got into press, media all over the world because of it. But the other thing that we did in Montreal was ACT UP New York released a research agenda. It was the first time we'd really put together a scientific document that was critiquing the current research effort at the NIH, and with recommendations of what they needed to do. And that included a suggestion to make experimental drugs available to people before they were approved. And we had an idea about how that could be done and how you could collect data from that and do it safely. And we put that document out, and Tony Fauci read the document and was asked about it in the press. The New York Times asked him about it. And he actually said, there are a lot of good ideas in here and we should be talking to these people. And that opened a door and changed in many ways. It was one important step in changing the nature of the relationship between the activists and the government and the researchers, particularly around research and science. Because we moved from primarily being outsiders who were screaming to get in to people sitting at a table having a conversation. And it wasn't all smooth from then on. There was a lot of fighting. There was still a lot of demonstrations that needed to happen. But that began a relationship that really changed things and led to bringing people living with AIDS into the research process in a way that had never, ever been done before, where we were helping to design the clinical trials. We were setting the research priorities along with the scientists. And Tony was the one who opened that door and made it happen because he understood the value. So many of the researchers at the time were scared of us. They were both scared of us and thought we had nothing to offer. Tony saw that we weren't a threat. We weren't going to hurt anybody. We were never violent. There was always this concern that we were going to attack the researchers. We never attacked anybody. So he saw that we were actually not violent people and that we weren't just emotional people. You know, we weren't just, oh my God, we're dying, we're dying, we're dying, we need help. We have ideas, we have thoughts about this, and these thoughts are valid and you need to listen to them. And he saw that and made that happen.
So it was 1989, you say?
Yeah, that was 89.
What, 30 years after now?
More.
We had another pandemic.
Yeah.
We had another, I don't know how to call it, like a collapse of many international decision makers, systems, healthcare systems. Do you think that looking sort of back to the COVID pandemic, which is not over yet, but it's definitely, we probably, hopefully, fingers crossed, we have gone through the peak already with vaccines and everything. Did we learn the AIDS lessons or did we not?
I'm a little hesitant to, I think that there are lessons from AIDS that can be applied to COVID, but there are also, AIDS is very different than COVID. And so not all of it is applicable to me.
How it is different and what do you think can be applicable? Because for the recent 2 years, we've heard so many comparisons between COVID and AIDS, and like obviously, including because of the fact that Fauci was involved back here and then and all of that. But what's different and what's in common?
Well, certainly what's different is that COVID can affect everybody and anybody at any time. The way that it's transmitted is very, very different than HIV. It's not all that easy to get HIV. Right, you have to really engage in some very specific acts that are, you know, sexual behavior or drug taking.
Well, let's say honestly, most of them are pleasurable.
Yes, yeah, they are activities that we like, which of course makes it riskier. But because we like to do the things we like. But you know, I can't get HIV by walking into the supermarket, but I can get COVID by walking into the supermarket. I can't get HIV by living with a person who has HIV, right? I can't get it by sharing the same house with them or the same workspace, but I can get COVID that way. So that, I think, changes a lot of sort of what the public health approach needs to be. Have we learned the lesson? Well, I don't know. I mean, we never learned the lesson from AIDS in the first place. So, well, let me change the question, okay?
Okay.
Where are we right now in HIV? Because where we are right now in HIV is a fucking shit show. And everybody, you know, the UN and the Global Fund love to talk about how we're going to end AIDS. You know, we're ending AIDS in 7 years. We ended discrimination 2 years ago, according, you know, to the UN targets. So we're not ending anything in 7 years. This idea that we could end AIDS in 7 years is a lie and a fiction, and distracts not only the public health establishment, but distracts the activists from how bad our situation is right now. And so, you know, what's the parallel with COVID? Well, the world did not respond well to COVID. Here we had a global pandemic, and governments did not come together and say, how do we stop this? How do we use everything in our power to stop this? Instead, meager amounts of money, competing vaccines without any attempt to determine which vaccines are more effective than others, profits before people in terms of vaccine availability, really failing to step up and address a public health crisis, right? There was no real global effort to grapple with this incredible pandemic that is really, I don't think we understand yet how deeply it's changed us, you know, locking us down for 2 years. We're going to see the effects of that for a generation. But what's happened in AIDS over the last bunch of years? The money's gone down when it's supposed to go up. They talk about ending AIDS, but the money keeps getting cut. The Global Fund held its replenishment in September. They asked, right, if the replenishment was not successful, right? They like to put a spin on it and make it sound like it was successful. It was not successful. They didn't reach the target that they set. They didn't really come anywhere near that target. If they had reached the target, right? They were looking to raise $18 billion for the next 3 years for HIV, TB, and malaria. If they had reached the $18 billion target, there still would have been a $28 billion gap in what was the amounts of money that were needed to meet the needs of the 3 diseases. Using, you know, the cost estimates from UNAIDS and WHO. Right? So even if they had raised $18 billion, $28 billion funding gap, somebody's getting left behind. Who's it going to be? Who's it going to be in Russia?
Probably the same people that in the US, the drug users.
The drug users, the gay guys, the sex workers, the poor women, right? The children. That's who's getting left behind. That's who's been left behind from day one. And that situation now is about to get a lot worse because the money is disappearing. The money for treatment, the money for prevention, the money for advocacy, right, is gone. Not totally gone, but nowhere near what it ought to be. And who's going to bear the brunt of this the most? You know, the people that ITPC works for and with. So, did we fail to learn the lessons of AIDS? We still haven't learned the lessons of AIDS.
Back in the 80s, when there was desperation, you had an inspiration and you had a hope, and there was no time to stop and you had to move quickly. Okay, now, like probably the most active people, those who are trying to reach out for something, they got their treatment, right? They are mostly on drugs themselves, with rare exceptions that we know, the people who still refuse to take the ARVs from the government until the last person in their country gets the treatment. But what do you think now, we as activists in the war zones, which is Europe now, in the middle of refugee crisis, humanitarian crisis, with political oppressions, with the governments that are not willing to even say the name of LGBT people or talk about any marginalized people, where is the lighthouse? Where is the direction that activism should go? Did we lose activism or did we not?
I don't think we've lost activism. I think activism is ever present. But it changes, and movements change, and they arc. In the 1980s, we had no treatment. Not because I couldn't get, somebody had the treatment and I couldn't get it, but because it didn't exist. I had no prevention. It didn't exist. So the major challenges, I mean, there were huge political challenges, but the biggest challenge were the scientific challenges. Most of those questions in HIV have been addressed. We still don't have a cure. We still don't have a vaccine. Very important to develop both of those things, but we have very, very effective treatment. We have very, very effective prevention for HIV now. So the problems that keep people from getting infected and from dying from AIDS are no longer really scientific questions. They're political questions that are not necessarily HIV specific questions. They're the same reasons people are dying from TB when we have treatment for TB, when they're dying from malaria, when they have treatment for malaria, when they're dying from diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. It's a problem of the failure to have an effective global public health movement and global public health response. Our governments don't care about health, right? They don't care about the poor, they don't care about gay people and sex workers and drug users, but we're a part of a much larger group of people that our governments don't really care very much about. I don't know. I think we're in a state of transition, and there's always going to be HIV specific work to do, but we can't solve our HIV specific problems without thinking about broader problems, about healthcare being a right and meeting the health needs of people. It's not enough to save somebody by giving them HIV treatment so that they can die from hepatitis, so that they can die from diabetes. So I think we need to, as activists, we kind of need to think bigger. We need a bigger coalition. We need a bigger tent.
Is UHC, the universal healthcare coverage, this kind of tent, or not really?
No, UHC is a sham and a lie.
Why?
Because first of all, it's not universal health care, it's universal health coverage. So UHC is really about insurance schemes. And for all of this talk about UHC, have you seen any funding stream?
Not yet, but probably there should be one coming from this FIF, the new foundation that the World Bank is sort of developing, which is also underfunded and all of that.
This is, don't don't allow the UN and the World Bank to set your agenda. Because that's what they've done, right? They totally co-opted us. The Global Fund, the UN, the World Bank, they've totally co-opted us by getting us involved in their processes over and over and over again. We have to fight for UHC. Now we have to fight for pandemic preparedness. That's the new buzzword, right? We're not even talking about UHC anymore because we're talking about pandemic preparedness, right? And it's one of these things after another, and there's never anything behind it. And instead, we as activists get drawn into these processes. We sit at endless PCB meetings at UNAIDS, endless discussions with the Global Fund about, what is the Global Fund spends money on training you to be a good CCM participant. But they don't provide any money for activists to do their work. They draw us into their process. How to be a good CCM participant, how to build community-led monitoring programs into your Global Fund application. That's the big flavor right now, right? We're going to teach people how to apply for community-led monitoring money in their country's Global Fund proposal.
We have
no money for community-led monitoring that's going to be in any Global Fund proposal.
We have decided that we are going to make the t-shirts for the hopefully next or some other AIDS conference, like we did CLM before it was a thing, proudly since 2010.
Thank you very much. I have nothing against community-led monitoring, right? I've been doing it a really long time. But this idea that the Global Fund is going to start funding community-led monitoring when it barely has enough money to pay for pills and nurses. The day the Global Fund retreated and said, we are no longer going to be funding in middle-income countries, that they're going to have to transition out. That was the day where we failed, because that's the day we should have shut that building down. And we didn't do it.
Is there still a way to reverse the process?
They don't have any money to do that.
Okay, I'm trying to find the
I'm sorry, like you call me, I'm in a dark place. That's what you're going to get from me.
No. I'm not saying that you should, start to dance like a cheerleader and say that. Well, some would love to see that, but we can do it offline.
I don't, you two are sitting in, I don't know, is there a government that has responded to HIV worse than your government? I really can't think of one. So, you guys you've been dealing with the worst of it from day one. And, what I find so incredible is how smart and courageous and brave and persevering you've been. Because excellent work, and it's very hard to keep doing that work, and no matter how well you do it, you don't get the progress that you should be getting. That's incredibly hard to me.
And that's not the end. We're still gonna be there.
Yeah,
we're still gonna be there. So I'm also not in the brightest spot, and at the end of the day, it's almost midnight over there. But because I'm in Bishkek right now, look at where the activism brought me.
It's dark, right? It's midnight, so it's really dark over there right now. And but you asked me very early on in this discussion, what made us happy, what brought us joy. And, I've seen you all work together. It's that coming together that I think brings hope.
Yeah,
And-
that's exactly what I wanted to say, closing the call, that what I hear from you, what I heard from Greg, what I heard from Peter, is that it's not people like leaders, like Fauci's, in a way, who change the game. It's the communities that stick together. So I think that's something that people have to remember, that we have to stick together and support each other.
That's right. That's really, because when all else fails, that's what we've got. And that's what we can count on.
Ladies and gentlemen, Дэвид Барр. Boom. Thank you so much, David, for
Thank you.
I hope that was all right.
I would be very impressed with stories. I got great pleasure for communication. I haven't words.
Okay. See you guys in the next podcast video interviews. I really hope we're going to talk to David more, and we're going to record some more interviews about other topics, including the ITPC history. But for now, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Anytime at all.